Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature. We're a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who podcast network. My name is Jason, and my guest this week is also Jason. Jason Davis, a warm welcome back to Doctor Who Lit.
Solaway, Jason.
My Latin is very, very weak. How about a translation for my non-Latin speaking users?
Greetings of the general Roman greeting, I think. Although we both have Greek names, so, you know, we're kind of at odds with the population of this book.
Iasonos, which is Greek for doctor or healer, which means that Rose Noble, whose dead name is Jason, means she was literally named Doctor.
Yes. That was a nice touch, I thought.
I'm also reminded of Peter Sellers in the opening scene of the Stanley Kubrick version of Lolita, where he's playing Roman ping pong. Roman ping, Roman pong. The second I heard that joke, I knew the rest of the 2.5 hours of the movie were not going to work for me, and they didn't.
I've never seen Lolita. That's the only Kubrick film I've not seen.
You've seen Fear and Desire?
Yep.
Didn't enjoy it.
No.
It's very atypical of Kubrick. I like the ending, but the rest of it is very atypical. You can see why he disavowed it. It doesn't really speak to his oeuvre.
It's kind of a weird extended Twilight Zone episode that doesn't quite land.
Very dream spacey, yes. I won't spoil the ending, but it's only an hour long, so if anyone here has not seen Fear and Desire, you can find it on YouTube or the usual places. The last few minutes I happen to like, but the process of getting there is a bit of a slog for me. I think Paths of Glory is a much better Kubrick war movie.
Yes.
That is a very safe opinion.
Yes. Nobody's going to argue that with you, or if they do, we have they're a very interesting person. So talk about, tell me what you think of the Romans. What have the Romans done for you?
I mean, the Sondheim song from A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Comedy Tonight, is always running through my head on some background level at any given time. So I think about the Roman Empire a lot, to talk about last year's internet meme. I can tell you when I first saw the Romans. It would have been when the Hartnell package came to East Coast PBS, New Jersey Network. Unearthly Child aired in September 1985, and they showed a Hartnell episode in movie format every week, except for the last week of the month, which was always reserved for another season 22 Colin Baker episode. So I would have seen the Romans at the very end of 1985, and then I would have seen it again when the Hartnell package came to Channel 21, my local PBS station, in early 1987. And at that point, I was making a VHS collection of just the Hartnell years. So I had Romans on VHS from 1987. And I can tell you, as the rare American teenager who loved black and white TV, I watched the Romans a lot in the 80s and early 90s. Until my first phase of Doctor Who fandom started to peter out. The book I would have got when it came out or shortly thereafter. I remember reading it and not liking it because I was a Doctor Who literalist, and I wanted the book to mirror the episode as closely as possible. The book is a comedy book, so there's a lot of comedy at the expense of the characters. And at the time, I cared about that a great deal. It bothered me that the Doctor was written in a certain way and that Ian was written in a certain way, and that Delos, Ian's friend in the Roman galley, was not quite portrayed the way that Peter Diamond, the stuntman, who was later in Star Wars, portrayed him on TV. So the book irked me in 1990, and I can tell you I have not read the book again in 34 years until this week. So while the Romans has been a large part of my Jason's real estate brain for a long time, the book has not shared pride of place. So that's a long way of saying that is my Romans origin story. Jason, how about yours?
The Romans is kind of one that I'm less familiar with. I didn't see it until the formal VHS release, which was, I guess, the mid-90s. I probably bought it while I was working at Best Buy so we're talking probably 97, 98. We had a really good discount on Doctor Who VHS tapes at Best Buy, 5% over cost.
Was that because of you, or was that just a corporate policy that Doctor Who got most favored nation status at Best Buys nationally?
No, it was just 5% over cost for employees.
For you, okay, got it.
Anything you bought. And so that was probably the last period of time where my Doctor Who VHS collection grew significantly was 97, 98.
See, I worked at an independent bookstore on Long Island in late 1999 and early 2000 before I passed the New York bar. We had a 20% employee discount. So when I was buying the 8th Doctor Adventures and past Doctor Adventures from my employers, it was 20% off the $5.95 cover price. Best Buy only gave a 5% employee discount.
Well, you also have to remember that they were selling VHS tapes as a loss leader, so they were already quite low.
Got it. What was your job title at Best Buy?
Media specialist, I think.
Were you there for the rollout of the DVD? Because I got to say, the DVD room at Best Buy was my favorite place in the world for a good 10 years. That's
probably the main reason I quit. I got tired of explaining to people why the DVDs wouldn't play in their CD players. You can only have that conversation so many times a day before you're ready to go and work at a comic book store.
Trust me, before this call, I was on the phone with my work organization's national help desk for 30 minutes trying to solve the CrowdStrike security issue that turned my home laptop into a blue screen of death brick. And I'm pretty savvy as a tech user, and I was able to follow his instructions, and I never said, press any key. Which one's the any key? And even with me being savvy, it took 25 minutes for this poor devil to help me turn my computer from a blue screen of death brick into a functioning laptop. So I don't have the chops for customer service. I don't have what it takes to answer the most basic anodyne of questions over and over and over again. I can imagine that someone who doesn't know how a DVD works would certainly start to irk you after a while. But I have to say, you and I found much better careers after leaving retail and customer service.
Yeah, that's debatable, but yeah, So that's when I would have seen the Romans. Would have been sometime in probably 97, 98, and at that point I was sort of in a lull, Doctor Who wise, or coming out of my sort of peak of 90s Doctor Who, right around the McGann movie, and so it didn't really leave much of an impression on me. And looking at it again just yesterday, I watched the show after I read the book. People think of it as being this, intentionally comedic piece, and really, it's more in the execution than in the writing. A lot of the stuff that's in it, that's the funny beats, are things that were developed in rehearsal, like Barbara bashing Ian over the head with the water jug. That's not who does it in the script, and a lot of that stuff seems to have been worked out in the rehearsal phase. So this notion that Dennis Spooner wrote the first comedy Doctor Who, I think maybe that needs to be looked at a little bit closer. Now, that said, Donald Cotton clearly was going for a comedic effect with the book, which has so many jokes in it that are based on a modern understanding of things. It's just a very interesting take. I would have preferred something a little bit more. I mean, you talk about being a Doctor Who purist and being interested in having the story reflected in the book. I wouldn't go that far with myself. I'm actually more in favor of the books that do something new and different. And I love the epistolary aspect of it, but that automatically has a problem of sort of disenfranchising the characters who aren't represented in the various epistles chosen by Tacitus as his sort of dossier in the framing element. So, I mean, Barbara pretty much almost disappears from the book, and Vicky does pretty much.
Maureen O'Brien had very good comedy chops, and she's a large part of the reason why The Romans as televised works for me. And also, William Hartnell had a particular wheelhouse. And you can see when Innes Lloyd takes over and the show goes in a hard sci-fi direction why William Hartnell had to go. Mm-hmm. Because delivering technical sci-fi dialogue is not, bless him, I think he's still quite my favorite Doctor. It is not his strong suit. Comedy, historicals were his wheelhouse. He is never better than he is in a story like The Romans or a story like The Gunfighters or even The Mythmakers. So what's interesting about Doctor Who literature is because I go in publication order rather than story order, we are at a 2-week moment in the history of this show where we actually have consecutive Dennis Spooner scripts after we had 2 weeks of consecutive stories. We go from the Censorites to the Reign of Terror, consecutive books that were also consecutive TV stories. That doesn't happen very often, apart from Auton Invasion and Cave Monsters coming out in the same month in 1974. But then after Reign of Terror, which is Dennis Spooner's first script, the next book is The Romans, which is Dennis Spooner's second script.
Yeah.
And this all goes away with the next book, which is a Third Doctor story from 1970. But we're at a great Hartnell moment. Unfortunately, given my audience numbers over the last 4 weeks, I'm not sure the audience likes the Hartnell era as much as I do. But I think this is a great Hartnell story, even if a lot of that has to do with the actors rather than Dennis Spooner.
Well, it's just interesting to me also that you have this sort of oasis of Hartnell in the book publishing schedule. You kind of wonder had Nigel Robinson assigned out, several manuscripts, and then for whatever reason, a bunch of the Hartnell ones came in simultaneously. So you had this run of Hartnells, or was that planned? I mean, was that intentional that those came in with those dates, and just happened to be this run of Hartnell?
So I repeated this theory in last week's episode. I'm going to give it to you again. We are at a particular moment in time. This book is, I think, September 1987. My cat is sitting on my keyboard, so I can't verify with my text file.
Yes.
September 1987 means that the hardcover would have come out about 5 months earlier. Just for argument's sake, we'll say the hardcover came out in April of 87. That means the manuscript would have been submitted probably in late 1986. What's happening on television? Doctor Who goes off the air in spring of 1985 with Revelation of the Daleks. It ends on a freeze frame, and then there's an 18-month hiatus. Doctor Who and the Mysterious Planet, i.e. Trial of a Time Lord Parts 1 through 4, doesn't air until the autumn of 1986. That book is coming eventually, but Nigel Robinson, because of the hiatus, suddenly can only commission books for the first 5 Doctors. But the Davison era was finished with Black Orchid. There's no more Davison stories left to novelize. With the exception of Revelation of the Daleks, to which you can't get the rights, there are no more Colin Baker stories left to novelize. All the Tom Baker stories have been adapted. And the only John Pertwee story that hasn't been adapted, Ambassadors of Death, comes out as October 1987. But the point is that the only stories that are available for Nigel Robinson to commission in 1986-87 are Hartnell and Troughton stories, with the exception of Ambassadors of Death and Revelation of the Daleks. He has nothing else to print. Everything else has already been printed. So that's why this is a great run. I think 11 out of the last 12 books have been Hartnell or Troughton, with the exception of Black Orchid, which is the last of the Davisons.
Yeah. It's just interesting that we end up with that sort of run of Hartnell, where it's not, a little Hartnell, a little Troughton, a little Hartnell, a little Troughton. Because, I mean, we still have the Space Pirates and a few others, that we could have sprinkled in there. I don't know. The other interesting thing is I tried to find any indication of why Donald Cotton was the one chosen for it. And I think it just must have come down to it being, a comedic historical. And because of myth makers and gunfighters, he was the obvious choice.
Also, Dennis Spooner dies in September 1986. So even if they wanted to go to the original author, he would not have been available.
And Dennis Spooner didn't do prose. He specifically, there's actually a quote that I dug up where he made a comment about, give me just a second here. Let me pull that up. That's talk. There's dead air. Talk.
So we have Smudge sitting on my keyboard. What fascinates me about the Romans, it is the second William Hartnell story in about 6 months to have a cliffhanger that is a feline's face. Because Planet of Giants Part 1 ends with a cat looking at the camera. And then when the characters walk in front of the cat, it is clearly a matte still photograph, which led me to compose the poem for Rec Art's Doctor Who in the mid-1990s. The cat was just a mat. But then the Romans Part 2 ends with stock footage of a lion roaring into the camera. So you're entering this run. One cliffhanger is a cat's face. Another cliffhanger is a lion's face. They should have kept going. We should have had leopards. We should have had panthers. We should have had the ocelot. Doctor Who and the ocelots.
It was Gary Russell's obituary for Dennis Spooner. He said, referring back to his comments that he wrote English for speaking rather than reading, Dennis Spooner turned down repeated requests to novelize his Doctor Who scripts for Target books, but in 1985 gave his blessing for other authors to do so.
And Donald Cotton would have been a contemporary. Donald Cotton would have been commissioned first, I believe, by Dennis Spooner. One succeeded the other. They probably had a professional working relationship, if not an active friendship. So that makes Donald Cotton a good choice. Sadly, this is Donald Cotton's final novelization because he's already novelized both of his TV stories.
Yeah.
We've already covered the Mythmakers on this podcast. We've already covered the Gunfighters on this podcast. After this, he's out. This is his last target. And it is, like you say, as an epistolary, the only Doctor Who novelizations that follow this format are this one and arguably The Curse of Fenric, which is not a straight-up epistolary, but has a lot of documents as interstitials in between the prose chapters.
What's interesting also is that this is a return to the original format, in a sense, of the Doctor Who novel, because we get part of the story told from Ian's perspective, which is, how they all started.
That's right. That was the very first novelization, Doctor Who and the Daleks, episode 1 of this program. That is the most downloaded episode of Doctor Who literature, the very first one. So a lot of folks listened to that and then never came back, which is unfortunate because the format of the show has changed quite a bit since my very first episode.
Yeah. I do wonder if Cotton had chosen different narrators, if there would have been a little bit more to the book. I mean, you mentioned at the outset that this was not one of your favorites, or maybe that was before we started recording. But I was, just in comparing it directly to the program as broadcast, I mean, Tavius barely gets a mention in the book, yet he's sort of the major Roman character next to Nero in the show. That whole plot, gets minimized and sidelined, and all the stuff with Barbara is pretty much reduced to Nero's perspective on it, which is a little bit scary. Although you do get a good sense of imperial entitlement, I guess, in that regard.
Flavius is a very interesting character on TV because he resembles, for us American audiences, Telly Savalas. So it's really the closest you will ever get to a Doctor Who Kojak crossover when William Hartnell and Michael Peake are sharing a screen. He's a very funny, or at least the two of them have very good comic chemistry. He's in the Apoditarium. The Apodahouium?
Yes.
But
our hissing friend.
Our hissing friend, yes. Where it falls apart for me is episode 4, because Tavius is revealed to be an early Christian, and he holds the sign of the crucifix up as the Doctor is escaping. I think it was Christopher Barry on the DVD commentary who says it should have been a fish symbol, which would have been historically accurate in the year 64 AD. If Tavius was a very early Christian, probably would have been Jewish, probably would have adhered to a certain code of morality. Tavius is and I don't say this in a negative way, he's a conniving character who has people killed in order to further his aims. I'm not sure if that is historically accurate for what the earliest Christians, and they might not even have been called Christians in the year 64. That isn't my area of expertise. I find it a bit of an odd fit for part 1 through 3 Tavius with part 4 Tavius. I find it an odd fit. Maybe someone here who is more theologically minded can talk me down, but that last revelation for Tavius does not work for me and me alone.
Well, and I mean, and the only other sort of evidence to go along with that is the fact that he plucks Barbara out of the slave pens because she's being kind to somebody else, which, I mean, that's sort of like, those are the two sort of sprinklings of sort of this characterization that don't really appear elsewhere, where he's engaged in trying to assassinate the emperor. It seems almost like two characters might have been conflated when the script was being written. And what I mean, it's like somebody looked at the budget and said, yeah, we can only afford one person in the household for this part who's speaking. Can we conflate these two characters? And they was like, sure, no problem. Not realizing that it was the equivalent of, mashing two things together that shouldn't be mashed together. I was going to say like peanut butter and jelly, but then I realized, no, those are popularly together. Never mind. That metaphor broke down.
There's a very good children's picture book of recent vintage called Peanut Butter and Cupcake.
Mm.
And it's about Peanut Butter running around trying to find friends. And the recurring rhyme, because all children's books have recurring rhymes, is I'll make you giggle deep down in your belly, and we'll go together like peanut butter and cupcake. And it isn't until peanut butter meets jelly on the second to last page that we learn that PB and J are a great combination. The two great tastes that taste great together, to coin a phrase. But what I wanted to say is that literally is what happened, that two characters got conflated into one for budgetary purposes. Because the character of Sevchiria in episode 1 is a slave trader, and then for the rest of the story, he is Nero's court fixer.
Right.
And that's because I think it was Christopher Barry consolidated those two characters into one to save the budget of hiring a second actor. So Sevchiria was on the show for 4 weeks rather than him for 1 week and somebody else for 3. So I don't know if that's what happened with Tavius, but that is an interesting theory that actually matches the historical reality.
Mm-hmm. And then also in the book, you also have Donald Cotton taking a perhaps absurd interest in Ascaris, who, I mean, doesn't do much aside from attempt to assassinate the Doctor / Petulius in the in episode 2, or was that the end of episode 1, wherever it is. And he gets this running comedic, hiding in the sewers storyline for the book, and then you find out at the end of it that his mother is the poisoner.
Yes.
Which it's an interesting, again, an interesting decision to make him sort of one of the point of view characters. It also, greatly enhances his footprint in the book, whereas other characters like Tavius are being almost minimized out of the book, or for that matter, Barbara and Vicky, who Barbara has that one letter to Nero, which I don't know, just seems sort of odd to me that it almost seemed like it was enforced, after the fact, like the manuscript was written and then somebody said, Barbara kind of disappears from the book, like Nigel Robinson maybe said. Barbara kind of, vanishes from the book. So you get that one Barbara missive thrown into the middle of it there, just to sort of bring her back. And I wonder, it's one of those things I think maybe if the choice in point of view characters had been slightly different, the book might have been a little bit more successful. I mean, like I said, I like the fact that it's an epistolary. I like the fact that we get Ian's perspective. I like the fact that we get the Doctor's perspective, which comes across as honestly alien in a way that the Hartnell Doctor never did for me, particularly on screen. He comes across as having an alien thought process, not rooted in, sort of human thinking and human approaches to things.
Ascaris, that's the assassin, is very interesting for me on TV because Barry Jackson, who passed away about 10 years ago, had a very, very prolific career. The FYP page on my smart TV is always trying to get me to watch Midsummer Murders, and he was a regular for 14 years. He's only in 2 Doctor Who's, but he was also in Barry Lyndon, which makes him one of the few Doctor Who actors to have been cast by Stanley Kubrick. As an aside, Stanley Kubrick was watching the Daleks' master plan and called the production office trying to get advice from Douglas Camfield while he was in pre-production for 2001: A Space Odyssey. So you can imagine that Stanley Kubrick might have been like a hardcore closet Whovian. And maybe the only reason that he cast Andre Morell in Barry Lyndon is because Andre Morell was in Doctor Who: The Massacre. And Barry Jackson has a very small part in Barry Lyndon, but he's in it. But his 2 Doctor Who characters, Ascaris doesn't speak, and Drax in Armageddon Factor speaks in a very exaggerated, comic, over-the-top accent. It begs the question, why was he cast in a mute role when he's a character who can do great things with his voice?
It is odd, yeah. I mean, and again, I would love to see maybe some other drafts of the script. Obviously, the one that's on the Blu-ray is the camera script, so it's pretty close to what we got, with all changes and rehearsals being the only things that really, weren't logged on that script. But you do kind of wonder if when he was cast, there was maybe some more going on there than what we got in the finished product, or maybe he just seemed like a good guy for the role, or maybe he was a friend of the director.
He's also only 26 when The Romans comes out. And while Wiki only gives his partial filmography, he only has 1 role before The Romans. Now, that's something called The Primitives, which does not have its own Wikipedia page. And he plays the role of messenger, so I assume that's a walk-on part where he goes, "Here's your package," and walks away.
Maybe he doesn't even say, "Here's your package."
Right. Possibly in the infancy of what became an incredible career. So maybe he wasn't cast because he was Barry Jackson. He was cast because he was a young body just out of drama school who could walk across the screen and not fall over.
Could be. Wasn't a personal friend of Jacqueline Hill like Derek Francis.
I think Derek Francis is one of the triumphs of this piece. And while we could say that Nero is a problematic character as written because of the comedy raping, Derek Francis is 41 but could pass for 70. He does a great job, and he and Hartnell have this blazing comic chemistry, which is just a delight to watch. And that's possibly one of the reasons why I've watched The Romans as many times as I have.
I was kind of mesmerized by the flaming architecture plans. I mean, he's walking for a significant amount of time with a flaming prop that isn't, it's not like a torch where the flame is going to be where the fuel is at the top of it. He's walking with a burning piece of paper through a live studio. Bits of it are falling off with, the sort of like little floating fiery bits of paper that come off when you start a fire in your fireplace. And he's just walking around waving it about for an entire like run of the script. And you're just like, wow, that, obviously it's a stage performance because that's what this sort of television was at the time. They're used to that sort of thing. But you still look at it now, and all I can think is somebody who writes about television is, where's the fireman standing? How close is he? What kind of extinguisher is he armed with, or does he just have a bag of, a bucket of sand?
Right.
But I mean, that's the sort of thing that I think of when I look at that. I'm just thinking, okay, there had to be somebody in the fire, there had to be a fireman on hand. There had to be all the precautions necessary. At least I hope that's the case. I know what happens on a set in the 90s when you have a live fire gag on screen, and for a much smaller portion of time than what we're seeing on The Romans, where he's literally just walking down the hall, with this piece of flaming rolled up papyrus or whatever it is.
I don't have to light a match very often. I am not a smoker, and we have one of those automatic lighters at home for candle purposes. But when I do light a physical match, which is pretty much only to light the Hanukkah menorah 8 days a year, I am very squeamish and scared of the match burning too far down the stick and singeing my fingers and then dropping the match, and then the whole place catches fire. That is a particular phobia that I've had for decades now. If I were to be an actor running around carrying a flaming brand of paper for 10 minutes at a time, I would be the last person you would cast to do that.
Yeah. Well, you also have to remember they were probably, most of them probably smokers. So they're probably used to fire more so than, in a day-to-day usage than those of us today who are not smokers would be. So, I mean,
True.
There's that to consider.
But the amount of energy, remember, they're filming these 25-minute episodes live to tape in a 75-minute block. Nero's in parts 2, 3, and 4. He has to keep that energy up for 75 minutes in a row on 3 consecutive Fridays. Now, some actors deliberately hold back in rehearsal. I don't know if he was one of those, but it's impressive to watch him just as a physical matter of somebody who has to keep that up for that long. I am in awe of how he's able to sustain the comedy and the particular characterization.
Definitely. I mean, you mentioned Nero being a problematic character. I think even beyond the what's going on in the plot of the story, he's a Roman emperor, which makes him inherently a problematic character, being a member of the Roman ruling class.
Yes.
But so he's got issues above and beyond his personal behavior. But yeah, it's well written. The portions of the book regarding Nero are well written because you get the entitlement on the page. You get the assumption of imperial entitlement, as it were.
I have seen alternate readings from historians that Nero was not as problematic as history remembers him, and that he was not, in fact, fiddling while Rome burned, and he, in fact, was not responsible for the Great Fire of Rome. And a lot of that was negative propaganda years later. But it would not be an interesting Doctor Who story if Nero is a regular, decent guy. Nero has to be the comedy villain of the piece in order for this to work as a comedy. It's just the fact that he's running around trying to sexually assault Barbara, and it's passed off as comedy rather than something that's awful. It's a particular style of comedy. It is problematic. It doesn't bother me personally because I take it for what it is. You could never do it today, obviously.
No, well, and there's that tradition in British cinema of the Carry On films, which would have been, at their height at that point, which are all these sort of farcical sort of things, and obviously that's one of the inspirations for the Romans as a serial.
Yes.
So much so that I think the Roman installment was actually in production at the same time or relatively close.
And I don't know how it maps on to a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, which was fairly recent in 1963.
Yeah.
But John Pertwee, of course, was a major part in that, and he ends up being Doctor Who 6 years later.
Yes, and the one of the last jobs Pertwee was doing before he got Doctor Who was in a play by Donald Cotton.
Although the movie version of Forum only has Pertwee in a small walk-on because his role was given over to American comedian Phil Silvers.
Yes, Pertwee was in My Dear Mr. Gilbert by Donald Cotton about Gilbert of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. And in fact, Pertwee played Gilbert, and then he left at some point, and this was in 1969. So I'm wondering if he actually left to go shoot Spearhead, and at that point, Cotton took over the role of Mr. Gilbert.
Wow, he would have, because Spearhead, I think, films in June of 69, if memory serves me right.
Mid-69, yeah. So that's probably what it is, unless this play had a very, very short run, which, is also possible. I couldn't find much information about it, but Donald Cotton had an interesting career. He was involved in, among other things, he wrote the original script for Adam Adamant, which went on to become Adam Adamant Lives, with an exclamation point at the end, and was Verity Lambert's second sort of fantasy production for the BBC.
Right, so there's a lot of crossover between Verity Lambert, Donald Cotton, John Pertwee, and the Romans.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about William Hartnell in this. We talked a little bit about Maureen O'Brien. We've talked about Derek Francis as Nero. We've talked about Michael Peake as Tavius. The Romans, one thing interesting about it is part one is almost a self-contained one-part story. And then parts 2 through 4 take place in Rome proper. Then you also have the comedy trope that the characters are always just missing each other.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody runs down the street, turns a corner, and then the other character shows up on the same street in the opposite direction, and they're calling out each other's names, and they have no idea that they're there. Which leads to the funny bit at the end, where the Doctor and Vicky get back to the villa one day after Ian and Barbara, and totally missed the fact that Ian and Barbara had this whole series of adventures face-to-face with Nero. So what that leads us to is Ian and Barbara. It has become an article of faith in fandom that Ian and Barbara are a couple and that they got together in this story. David A. McKinty wrote a past Doctor adventure towards the end of the run in the early 2000s called The 11th Tiger, which is based on historical fact, but it ends up being a sequel to a 1970s Doctor Who story with real historic figures in it. And this is set after the Romans, and it has Ian and Barbara as a couple getting engaged. But we talked about how in the Reign of Terror last week, Ian Marter is not writing Ian and Barbara as a couple. So for you, how do Ian and Barbara work as an on-screen couple? Is the Romans our only textual support for that? And is any of that preserved for the Donald Cotton novelization?
Well, I think the fun thing about the Cotton book is that Ian's letters are addressed to his headmaster, who I guess is, his buddy. Although he calls him headmaster, but there's a sort of familiarity in the writings that he's writing to said headmaster, which suggests that they're friends. Although, he doesn't call him Bill or Fred or whatever his name is, but he does assure him that he and Barbara have not vanished to elope and go off, and and that's not why they're missing from their job. They have in fact been abducted by a deranged time traveler, and they have not eloped because after all that might invalidate their pensions. So that's kind of one of my favorite lines from the novelization, is that he's assuring the guy they haven't eloped. because he wants to make sure that their pensions are intact when they get back from this adventure, which, obviously he was doing okay by the time Clara was working at Coal Hill School. But as for their relationship, yeah, I mean, certainly everything that we have to suggest a relationship is in that first episode, The Slave Traders, where they're just sort of carrying on like a old married couple, to use a cliche. And then they have their adventures. And I mean, he spends the entire story trying to get Barbara back. I think that's actually amped up in the book because he keeps making that point. And then, as you mentioned, Delos is completely characterized in a completely different fashion from the way the story on television had it, where he was sort of Ian's loyal companion assisting him in his mission, whereas the other guy is just like, I want to get home, and if I have to kill you to do it, okay, So yeah, it's interesting that there is an actual reference to elopement in the book, and one wonders if Ian is protesting too much in his letter to the headmaster. It's interesting, and of course, is it the commentary for this one where Toby Haydock questions William Russell about Ian and Barbara, and William Russell's like, oh no, we never played it like that. It's one of the ones that Toby Haydock did the moderation on,
right,
from late in the DVD range.
Although you have to figure that a lot of the body language between Ian and Barbara in parts 1 and 4 was unscripted business developed in rehearsal. So maybe they were playing it that way in 1964 and didn't want to admit it. 2 points to talk about. Number one, the headmaster. We did not know this in 1964, and we did not know this in 1987, when respectively the TV and the book come out. But we learn in 1988, courtesy of Andrew Morgan, that the headmaster is Michael Sheard. So that makes the Romans another
Michael Sheard appearance.
Another Michael Sheard appearance. Now, I am going to quickly give spoilers for Empire of Death, which is the most recent televised episode of Doctor Who, as you and I are sitting here recording in mid-July 2024. If you have not watched Empire of Death yet, if you were listening to this podcast 5 or 10 years from now, and you're doing the pilgrimage in order, and you're a long way from Empire of Death, the 2024 season finale, hit the 30-second fast forward button right now. Since every Doctor Who story after Pyramids of Mars is now a sequel to Pyramids of Mars, thanks to that script, I have yet to reach a book since Empire of Death aired that is a sequel to Pyramids of Mars. This week is not, next week is not. I think the next novelization that's a sequel to Pyramid of Mars will be the season 23 novelizations coming out soon. So this is not a Pyramids sequel, but it is a Michael Sheard story. So let's give credit to the great Michael Sheard. One more Doctor Who story under his belt.
That is funny. I didn't even think of that, but yeah, that's a lovely point. It is very strange that Ian is writing letters to the headmaster, who, I mean, like I said, it's a weird tone because he's referring to him as headmaster, so there's a formality there, but at the same time, it seems to be like his only guy friend that he can write to back in 1963 London.
Right. We know nothing about Ian Chesterton's personal life. We don't know who his buddies are. Yeah.
It's very strange. And then the doctor's journal, which is obviously not the journal that he'll be fooling around with just after his regeneration, since it gets left behind in ancient Rome and collected by Tacitus somehow or other.
Yes.
So there's also this sort of sheaf of documents that Tacitus comes by, and Tacitus is only like 10 or 11 when the story takes place. So, this is obviously, these papers have existed in this Roman villa in Assisium for some time, and they fall into Tacitus's hands for the frame story of this book, which is him being kind of a pompous best-selling author. Interesting take on Tacitus. The amount of sort of just modern day overlay in the Romans. I mean, even down to the slave traders, when they come to the villa where Barbara and Ian are, they pretend to be heating engineers, coming to check on the under the floor heating, but in the middle of summer, so that should be suspicious. But I'm like, sinister heating engineers, that's something out of Brazil, which would have been out just before Donald Cotton would have been working on this novelization, and I kind of find myself wondering, had he seen Brazil? Is he imagining Bob Hoskins and his associate coming to the door, when he's writing these two slave traders pretending to be heating engineers? It's just all sorts of interesting things like that. I mean, also there's a line in the doctor's diary where he's wondering if Chesterton is actually his name. So that's sort of boosting up that paranoia that you got in the very earliest serials back when the Doctor was concerned with Chesterton and Wright being spies or trying to encroach on his world.
See, I read that line as a pun, a meta pun on the fact that Hartnell's characterization of the Doctor has him always getting Ian's name wrong, almost certainly on purpose.
Yeah,
Chesterton, Chatterton, Chesterfield, Charto, it just goes on and on.
Yeah,
it's
that could be as well.
One of the bits of evidence used to say that Hartnell didn't know what he was doing. Of course, this was all scripted comedy, getting the name wrong on purpose as a character beat. So that's how I read it.
Yeah, well, then you also have him complaining about Barbara and Vicky's unauthorized orgy of public spending, which in the televised version, because we follow Barbara and Vicky into the marketplace, and that one you actually have Barbara, trying to be fairly frugal by not having Vicky express so much interest with the haggling clothing merchant, saying don't pretend you're so interested in it. We'll come back to her later, and then maybe we can, get a lower price out of her.
It is a feature of Donald Cotton's writing that he intentionally puts anachronisms in his prose.
Yeah.
I haven't finished writing the audio essay for this week's episode that will air immediately after our interview, but I'm going to try and have it about 10 minutes long. If I were to go joke by joke through this book, it would take 2 hours, and nobody's going to listen to that. I'll just do a roadmap to the book in general. But what Cotton did in the Mythmakers and in the Gunfighters is he would have anachronistic jokes that mashed up Shakespeare and the Bible and 19th or 20th century comedy touchstones. It's a very interesting frenetic style of writing where he's desperate to cram in as many in-jokes and references as he can.
I mean,
it is hard to imagine anybody.
He has Tacitus prefiguring Shakespeare in the introduction.
Exactly, and that is part of the audio essay that I have already written. He is the only person that I can see writing this book. Anybody else who was tasked with writing the Romans would do a scene-by-scene adaptation of the TV script. Then Terrence Dicks could make it very funny, and Ian Marter could make it very, very bloody. And if you had hired one of the other novelization writers, like a William Ems or a Paul Erickson or a Glyn Jones, who had a very tenuous grasp on what makes a good sentence, it might have been a dull mess. Even though the comedy in the book isn't really my type of comedy, and while it isn't the book that I read over and over again for comfort, I think Donald Cotton is the best person to adapt it. He was the person who was closest to that particular style of comedy.
Let me ask you this, since you obviously you've read more of the novelizations than I have. I had not read this one, in fact, until just this week. But is Donald Cotton the writer of Doctor Who novelizes somebody else's work at this time period? I mean, leaving aside Ian Marter, who was kind of a regular. I mean, because Ian Marter, Terrence Dicks are kind of the staff writers at this point, if you will, for the or were up until so many of the original writers started doing their own novelizations. Are those people and Nigel Robinson the only other people writing other people's novelizations at this point? I didn't say that very clearly.
Jerry Davis wrote The Celestial Toymaker, but he didn't really write it. As far as I know, he farmed it out to Alison Benjamin, who was... I've heard conflicting theories about what their relationship was, but at the very least, she was a young scriptwriter when he was a Hollywood executive, so they would have had some professional connection. Obviously, back in the day, Malcolm Hulke novelizes the camera scripts for Green Death, which are very different to the finished product. But looking back along the list, every other story, apart from Terrence Dicks and Donald Cotton, is novelized by its original writer, going all the way back to before Nigel Robinson became
Right.
the editor of the line. I mean, you have Peter Grimwade, you have Barbara Clegg, you have Stephen Gallagher using a pen name, you have Christopher H. Bidmead, you have friend of the podcast, Andrew Smith. Hello, Andrew, if you're listening. Eric Sayward even novelized his first TV story, David Fisher. So that's going back to 1984. Looking ahead at what's to come, we are going to have to tackle the Massacre on the show soon. The Massacre was novelized by the guy who did not write The Massacre as televised, because Donald Tosh didn't do novelizations. That is going to be a very interesting conversation to have when we get to The Massacre on this show. Everything else after this is pretty much done by its original scriptwriter, except Mark Platt will novelize Ben Aronovich's Battlefield towards the end of the line. There may be one or two other examples of somebody else not novelizing their own story or giving it Terrence Dicks or Nigel Robinson, but I think that's pretty much over by this point on the target line.
Yeah. Just interesting that Donald Cotton is sort of one of the few who does somebody else's story and isn't one of the regular target writers. And I think it probably comes down to he was probably good on a deadline, delivered what was needed in the time allotted for the money on offer.
And also, this is his third book in 2.5 years, so he almost was an in-house writer at this point, because Mythmakers comes out as a paperback in September of '85, and The Gunfighters comes out in January of '86, and then The Romans comes out in September of '87. So he was keeping the writing offices pretty busy. 3 books in 2 years will do well for you.
Yeah, definitely.
So we are coming towards the end of our scheduled hour together. There's 2 other recent features on this show that I do to fill out the time.
Okay.
Number 1, I'm going to ask you the 3 Darren Mooney questions from the 250 podcast. And I will just say as a side note that I have been watching my way through the IMDb top 250 movies, but only movies that I have never seen before. And I am setting aside animated films and Bollywood films, which for me are a whole different style of watching that I'm not ready to do right now. So I'm right now watching Paris, Texas, which, as of the time of recording, is number 250. Paris, Texas by Wim Wenders has been bouncing on and off the top 250 for months. And I'm watching it now. It is streaming on HBO Max. The 3 top actors in it are actors that I associate with sci-fi roles: Harry Dean Stanton, Dean Stockwell, and then the child actor is Hunter Carson, who was in the remake of Invaders from Mars a couple of years later. So Paris, Texas is a kitchen sink drama, but for me it's almost a sci-fi film in coding because of the 3 lead actors in it. But the 3 questions are as follows. Number 1, and I'm going to adapt it for Doctor Who, I'll say this again. Does The Romans belong on a list of the best 60 Doctor Who stories in the last 60 years?
If you particularly like The Romans, probably.
It is not on my list, because if I were to make my list as an absolute top 60, I would have a lot more historicals on it. I was trying to keep my list proportional. And I did have some stories standing for others. So I don't have every Dalek story from the classic series. I don't have every historical. The Gunfighters is in my top 15. So The Gunfighters is my Donald Cotton historical. I wasn't going to have 2. So The Romans is not on my list. But if I were not going to do a representational list, if I were to do a literal list, it is quite possible The Romans would be somewhere in the bottom of the top 60, like 59, 57. So second question is, would The Romans be on your personal list of 60 favorite Doctor Who stories, one you would pull out to watch for comfort, even if it's not as good as, say, a dark, well-made, gritty story like The Massacre? Would you rather watch The Romans if you were to pick your 60 favorite desert island Doctor Who stories?
I'm not a list person, as we established in the 2 Doctors, but, it's probably not a Doctor Who that I've seen that often.
And lastly, this is the third and final Darren Mooney question. If a listener has not seen The Romans yet, would you recommend they pause the podcast stream the episode to a local device, and then come back and listen to the rest of the show?
Well, I don't really get much out of listening to things that I have things about things I haven't seen, watched, or some otherwise digested. So that would just be a given. Yeah, I wouldn't listen to a podcast about something I knew nothing about, generally speaking.
But there are people who do, and I imagine that the 250 podcast has a much larger listener base than Doctor Who literature. This is kind of the ultimate niche show, out of print books from 50 years ago. For me, I think the Romans is a very important text in the evolution of Doctor Who. It is the moment where the historicals go from weighty, issue-laden dramas to outright farcical comedies. It is one of William Hartnell's best performances. It is still at a time when the Doctor is doing comedy violence. Hartnell is always bashing people over the heads the first 2 years of the show. And the Romans is another good example of that. He has great chemistry with Maureen O'Brien. And, of course, you have Ian and Barbara, who are so good together in their limited scenes in parts 1 and 4. So for me, even if the Romans is not a top 60, I think the Romans should be watched by anyone who is a student of Doctor Who wants to see how the show evolved between 1963 and 2024. So I think the Romans is one of the really good ones, obviously.
I like all of season 2 just for the experimentation. You know, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it's a bridge too far on the budget available. But I love all of the sort of what's going on during season 2. You know, the Romans, I think, is probably the first one that the first historical, I should say, that doesn't really care about being educational per se. It's more about printing the legend, if you will, than, say, Reign of Terror or the Aztecs or Marco Polo. And it's just sort of, it's an experimentation in tone, certainly. Also, probably the only story where they literally split the cast at the first episode and they don't come back into the end. Is it the first one that does that? I'm trying to think if there's any earlier examples of that, which of course becomes quite common, you know, narratively speaking, the further into the series you go.
Well, for the Reign of Terror, Dennis Spooner separates the four characters out. Ian and Barbara do not reunite until episode 4, I think 4 or 5. Yeah, episode 4 they reunite. And the Doctor doesn't see Susan and Barbara again until episodes 4 or 5. And they're not all together in the same room until the very end of episode 6.
Yeah,
so that may have been a Dennis Spooner trope.
A Spooner innovation to the format.
A Spoonerism, if you will.
Yeah, but I mean that's one of the things I particularly like Dennis Spooner's era as script editor, and I appreciate that a lot of what is at the beginning of that is not stuff that he commissioned. It's all, you know, the last of whatever Whitaker had in the pipeline. But I do think that sort of season 2, what we think of as season 2, you know, even though it starts with 2 holdovers from the first production block and doesn't, you know, finish until the beginning of season 3, broadcast season 3. You know, I love that run of shows because that's where, to my mind, Doctor Who is finally sort of figuring out what it is. I mean, and I think probably the Time Meddler is my favorite of that era, just because that's where we break down the wall between the original concept of historicals alternating with science fiction plays, and suddenly you have them. That's where Peanut Butter and Jelly was meant to come into this, I think. I'm bringing it back around. That's what's called the callback, folks.
The Time Meddler is coming up on the show. The book comes out shortly after September 1987. Time Meddler is in my top 60, but I will not say where. You'll have to tune back into that episode. And now it is time, as we're up to the last 5 or 6 minutes of our interview.
Oh.
We're going to play the second Doctor Who quiz book by Nigel Robinson. And since I've done a lot of the Adventures of the First Doctor, we're going to go to Adventures in History, second section. And do not pull a Jim Sangster and have the book on your lap. I'm going to ask you the first 5 questions in the Adventures in History section. Question 1. What was the Great Horse of Asia?
The Great Horse of Asia? You mean the Trojan horse?
Yes, exactly. That's the answer. The answer that Nigel gives is the Horse of Destruction, the Trojan Horse, the idea for which the first Doctor gave the Greeks, which is another Donald Cotton book.
Yep.
Question 2. Which intelligent creatures ruled the Earth before man?
Silurians. Well, and sea devils.
Yeah, that is literally the answer. The
Or Homo
Silurians and their
reptilius.
kin, the sea devils. Question 3. Which band of outlaws constantly threatened the security of Edward of Wessex in the 12th century?
The Vikings?
It is a reference to a very specific Doctor Who story, but not the Time Meddler, which does have Vikings in it. Edward of Wessex is a very specific Doctor Who character. I'll give you a narrowed down hint. He was played by Alan Rowe, who was also in Full Circle and Horror of Fang Rock. But it was Alan Rowe's first Doctor Who appearance. No, sorry, second Doctor Who appearance after the Moon Base.
It's fallen out of my head.
All right, I'll give it to you then. It is the Time Warrior. It is Iron Gron and his men.
Oh! Is that Alan Rowe, really? Oh, okay.
Yes. You've got 2 out of 3. 3 out of 5 is a winner. Question 4. Where did Professor Hayter, Hayter, believe himself to be when he was thrown back 140 million years in time?
Oh. Well.
He did not believe that he was in the Jurassic era. He believed that he was at a very specific geographic location.
Yeah, and I can't remember. That's the gentleman from the Time Flight.
Nigel Stock.
Yeah, Nigel Stock's character, and he thinks he's part of like some communist experiment or something, if I remember correctly. Or
yes, exactly.
Okay.
So if you were a Soviet prisoner, where would you be?
He thinks he's in like Moscow or Russia or something. The Soviet
Siberia,
Union.
but I'll give you the point.
Yeah.
So that's 3 out of 5. The last one is another Donald Cotton question. How did the Doctor and Stephen hope to escape from Odysseus in the Mythmakers?
The Mythmakers is one that I've listened to. I've not read the book. And I've listened to it, and I've listened to it probably last 20 years ago before they did the audio. the nice audio, the narrated audio. So I'm going to go ahead and plead ignorance on that one, as the Mythmakers is a blind spot.
It's a very deep cut question. It relates very specifically to episode 1. The Doctor offers to take Stephen to his blue box on the planet and sacrifice him. And then, of course, it turns out the TARDIS has disappeared, which happened in all the early historicals, and that's the part 1 cliffhanger. The TARDIS is gone.
Where had the TARDIS gone? Has somebody moved it?
The Trojans had taken it with Vicky inside, and that's how Vicky winds up in Troy in parts 2 through 4, and then never comes back.
Yeah, there are a few entirely missing stories where my knowledge of them is very, very, very limited, because either I've only listened to the audio or have just, never gotten around to further exploring them. But
you did get 3 out of 5, and that makes you a winner in the second Doctor Who quiz book game of the week. Jason Davis, thank you for playing. Where else might we be able to find you, either on our bookshelves or on the internet?
I wrote a book called Writing the X-Files, which is readily available in all the places where one might buy a book. Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, those sorts of places. I'm writing a book on Babylon 5 right now, the making of the 1990s television series. Actually, I'm writing probably 4 books on Babylon 5 right now, because the page count has rather gotten away from me. And you can find my newsletter, which is very, very erratic, at humanityismybusiness.com.
But not very, very errato, which is the creature from the pit.
No, not very errato at all.
And I believe you also edited someone else's memoirs that came out recently that was for sale at Galley.
Oh, yeah. Sandy. Stunt Lady. Sandra Gimpel's memoir of her time as a stunt performer and actor, from the 60s to the present day. I mean, it goes right up to things that she had shot while we were working on the book. So, I mean, this is somebody who was in the pilot episode of Star Trek playing one of the Talosians. She was Bill Mooney's stunt double on Lost in Space.
Wow.
You can find her book on, is it sandragimpel.com? You can also find it on Amazon. So,
And I will include a link to that in the show notes, and I will try and include a clean link to her website rather than just shunt everybody over to Amazon.
Yes, please. Yeah, I also edited Patricia Tallman's memoir, also a stunt performer and also one of the stars of Babylon 5, and that's available from b5events.com, which is her website.
Best known to me from Babylon 5, which I watched. I didn't watch the original, but I watched the TNT Ted Turner Cable Network rerun starting in 1997. 98. That was my last year of law school. All kind of blurs together for me. All right, Jason, thank you so much. I will have you on this show again when we return to the Sylvester McCoy era of novelizations, but it's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.
Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome to the Doctor Who Target Book Club podcast, the only podcast to discuss, in story order, all the Doctor Who novelizations. My name is Tony Witt, and every 2 weeks or so, I'm joined by a 2 to 3 person discussion panel, including our so-called expert who's been a Who fan since 1979. That would be me. We also get the views of intermediate, casual, and novice fans who either have never seen the show or who have never read these books until these podcasts, including
Dalton Hughes
and
Alison Fitz-Seyfried.
You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you find good podcasts, or even ones like ours. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Enjoy your travels.
Doctor Who, The Romans, by Donald Cotton. Televised as The Romans, teleplay by Dennis Spooner. Televised in January and February 1965. Paperback release date September 17th, 1987. Target book number 120. Cover artist Tony Masero. The TARDIS crew members have taken a break from their adventures and are enjoying a well-deserved rest in a luxury villa on the outskirts of Imperial Rome. But in the gory grandeur that is Rome, things don't stay quiet for long. If the time travelers can save themselves from being sold as slaves, assassinated by classical hitmen, poisoned by the evil Locusta, thrown to the lions, maimed in the arena, and drowned in a shipwreck, they still have to face the diabolical might of the mad Emperor Nero. As if that isn't enough, they also discover that, although Rome wasn't built in a day, it was burnt down in considerably less time. Boy, does Donald Cotton have a lot of big words. Here's how the book opens. Dear Sir, I am in reluctant receipt of your insufferable scroll, written, I must remark, on papyrus of so inferior quality that I can only suppose it to have been selected especially to suit the style of your grammatical construction and the insolence of your tone. One would have thought that even an empire in decline and fall might have seen fit to employ a scholar in the august position you have the effrontery to occupy, rather than a denarius-pinching, acidulous accountant with no apparent grounding in the humanities. The 4-page prologue is written by Tacitus, which is by now a familiar narrative trick by Donald Cotton, his previous 2 novelizations having been written, or at least narrated, by Homer and Ned Buntline. As with his previous 2 books, Cotton also cheerfully throws in anachronisms, with Tacitus here misquoting the not-yet-written New Testament, quote, the technocrat shall inherit the Senate, and Hamlet, quote, there are more things in Olympus on earth than are dreamed of by an urban district employee of lowly grade and status. Since I've already done long essays about Cotton's previous 2 novelizations, The Mythmakers, episode 97 of this podcast, and The Gunfighters, episode 101B, I'll be briefer this time. We're already familiar with the comic exaggerations and lush, if not heavy-handed prose style of Cotton. Also, Jason Davis gave a very good accounting of the book during our interview earlier. I will say this book is divided up into 7 principal narrators, 8 if you count Tacitus. We'll break them down one by one. Now, in his earlier two books, we saw that Cotton was very faithful to episodes 1 through 3 of the TV material, and then junked the respective episode 4s and wrapped up the stories in different ways in just a few pages. This book even more radically restructures the TV story, the 4-part TV story. Of course, it is beyond obvious to say that, so let's see how he does it. Ian Chesterton gets 7 journal extracts, all addressed to his headmaster, Michael Sheard of Coal Hill School, written from variously the Roman villa, the slave galley, the prison by the Colosseum, and then from the streets of ancient Rome shortly after escaping the episode 3 cliffhanger, which is largely absent from the book. Ian writes as if he's being paid by the word, in a comically obtuse tone. I couldn't envision William Russell reciting these words in what we think of as Ian's tone of voice, but Ian does make pop cultural allusions to Jack Benny and Kirk Douglas, two absolute heroes of my parents when I was growing up. The Doctor's 8 diary extracts take up by far the biggest portion of the book, starting with the second chapter, that's after Ian's first journal entry, and the final chapter. It was a house style of the Virgin New Adventures and then the BBC 8th Doctor adventures that you didn't narrate a book from the Doctor's point of view. Terrance Dicks was very good about dipping into the Doctor's head briefly, usually to explain away confusing plot points, and Ben Aronovich, in the 1990s novel The Also People, had some passages, brief passages, written from the Doctor's point of view that read kind of like found poetry. Donald Cotton writes much of his book in first person as the Doctor, but again, the Doctor, like Ian, speaks as if he's being paid by the word, and in a similar, comically obtuse style to Ian. The Doctor takes digs at both democracy and capitalism in his first entry. You couldn't reasonably expect Bill Hartnell to have memorized these lines, large chunks of dialogue or monologue, if he was performing them during the taping. Vicky on page 35 is overheard to refer to the Doctor as having senile dementia, and on the page after that, the Doctor literally bores the Roman centurion to tears with his stories, which seems a pretty harsh way to describe the first Doctor as an inept figure. Makes the book more like parody than comedy. Unlike on TV, the Doctor sees Barbara at the slave auction, page 47, but assumes that it can't be her, even after she frantically waves to him. On page 63, the Doctor knocks over the original Venus de Milo, causing it to lose both arms, which is historically inaccurate, by the way. The arms were found buried next to the Venus de Milo when it was uncovered in 1820. Now, there is a very funny passage on page 110, written as though the Doctor has real trouble communicating with Caesar Nero. Quote, "Speaking of which, I very much regretted that I would be unable to give my promised concert at his banquet that evening. I am not going to read this in Hartnell voice, that is not one of my specialties. At his banquet that evening, and as my particular and apparently personal assailant had got away with the loot." That was a pleasantry which failed to raise a smile, probably because, as I later realized on reviewing the conversation, the lute was an instrument which first appeared in Europe during the 14th century, and lute, as a synonym for booty, was hardly in general use until the Al Capone era. Such are the conversational hazards of time travel. Followed by a reference to Yehudi Menuhin, by the way, the third Jewish celebrity name-checked in the book after Jack Benny and Kirk Douglas. Go, my people. In another departure from the TV, the Doctor finally recognizes Barbara in Nero's court, page 113, followed by Ian on page 121. In the book, the Doctor can play music. It just has a horrifying effect on anyone who tries to hear it. And the Doctor inadvertently starts the Great Fire of Rome in a different fashion to that seen on TV. Ascaris, the assassin, played silently by Barry Jackson very early in the TV story, has a much larger presence in the book. He is the third most common narrator and the biggest narrator among the guest cast, and he gets a very different story arc. 6 chapters. These are genuinely funny. He's writing to his mother, who never responds to his letters sent home, and at the end we learn his mother is Locusta. The implication is she thinks he's an idiot and sent him off to the military to die in combat. Ascaris is recruited as an assassin and is hired by Nero to kill Maximus' battalion. Not for political reasons this time, but to eliminate Nero's chief rival for some coveted musical trophy. Other things Ascaris does in the book include accidentally killing the Roman centurion in the episode 2 material, having been trying to lunge at the Doctor instead. And the Doctor this is probably meant by Cotton to be hilarious, the Doctor unwittingly unleashes a pack of lions on Ascaris in page 101, which abets Ian's escape from the Colosseum in the Ian chapters, and the Doctor starts the Great Fire of Rome directly on Ascaris' head on page 122, although Ascaris happily survives all this mishegas. One nice part of the book, by the way, is that the narrative is interlocking. All the various letters and journal extracts are out of order, so the Doctor doesn't get 2 in a row, Ian doesn't get 2 in a row, but events in one extract are followed up in the very next extract by a different narrator, and we often get different perspectives on the same event, depending on who happens to be narrating it. The Empress Poppaea gets 3 chapters, the first of which appears on page 49, almost halfway into the book, and it's the first chapter not from the Doctor's or Ian's or Drax's point of view. Cotton has her as Caligula's niece. I'm not sure that's historically accurate. On page 76, she describes Nero's hands as flaccid, which I'm sure she wasn't talking about his hands. There's a Nero, my God, to thee joke on page 94, as she tries to proffer him some of Locusta's poisons. Nero also gets 3 chapters. The historical Nero would have been 26 when the story takes place, much younger than Derek Francis, if you need him. While the humor in the Doctor and Ian chapters are a bit samey for me, Nero, at least, is characterized by his own special brand of obtuseness, page 59. She, Poppaea, seems to have gone soft, and devotes herself entirely to good works. She's always ready to put up a Praetorian guard who's forgotten the curfew. In fact, I have even known her to visit the barracks at all hours of the night, just to see if there might be any young recruit feeling the cold. Not to put too fine a point on it, I would say editorially. Most of the rest of the Nero chapters are devoted to his pursuit, both literal and figurative, of Barbara. This sort of bedroom farce I feel is best seen and not read. The book chapters remind me of nothing so much as Norman Mailer's overlong novelization of Itchy and Scratchy, the movie. I think it's instructive to listen to some of the interaction between the Doctor and Derek Francis on TV. It goes by fast and furious, and it plays for me a little less labored than the attempts at humor in the novelization of the Romans.
Maximus, my dear.
Oh, my dear Caesar Nero.
I have a surprise for you. Guess what it is.
Well, now, let me think. You want me to play in the arena?
You guessed.
Well, it's no problem at all. After all, you want to do your very best for your fellow artists. Well, why not the arena?
Yes, of course. That is exactly right.
Yes, well, I promise you I shall try to make it a roaring success.
You'll have to play something special, you know.
Oh, yes, of course, yes. Something serious, yes. Something that they can really get their teeth into.
No, you can't. I've told no one.
Caesar Nero, I've always wanted to put on a good show, to give a great performance. After all, who knows? If I go down well, I might even make it my farewell performance. You see, I've always wanted to be considered as an artist of some taste. Generally regarded as, palatable. But I must be boring you. Oh, I must. Surely you have so many other important things to attend to without standing here, chewing over the facts with me. Good gracious, there's something burning.
My plans, my drawings for the new Rome! You fool, you idiot! A lifetime's work! I'll have you both killed over and over again! Guards! Guards! Fool! Idiot! Traitor! Pig! Mistaken into the arena on an island with water all round, and in the water there will be alligators, and the water level will be raised, and the alligators will get you! Fool! Traitor! Brilliant! You are a genius! genius, a genius. I will make you rich, rich.
While Vicky is voiceless in the book, apart from a Vicky joke in someone else's chapter, Locusta and Barbara get one chapter each. Amusingly, while all of Ascaris' chapters are about his mother, Ascaris is not even mentioned once on either of Locusta's pages. Barbara's chapter is a 2-page Dear John letter to Nero. Cotton in all of his chapters is fond of pairs of words, starting with the same letter, leading to the unlikely spectacle of Barbara referencing, quote, and I swear I'm not making this up, suppurating septicemia on page 80, with festering facade appearing on the next line. There are many, many reasons to love Barbara Wright the character. Few of those reasons appear in this chapter. On the whole, I would say that I was too young to appreciate this book when I first read it. The book does require some broad cultural knowledge, and American teenagers in the late 80s didn't exactly have that. This book would have come out my very first month of high school, for example, so I still had a lot of learning in front of me. Reading the book now, I find the humor a bit forced. Cotton throws a ton of big words, and both literary and grammatical puns at the reader. I would say that I appreciate the book more now, and it made me aware that it was meant to be very funny, all caps. However, I only laughed out loud once or twice. Of course, if you have to explain the joke, then it isn't really a joke, and all I've been doing throughout this essay is explain Donald Cotton's joke. Now, you might find the novelization of the Romans much funnier than I did. And if you're inspired by this episode to read the book, I sincerely hope you love it. For those about to laugh, I salute you. Next time on Doctor Who Literature, we're going to have a bonus episode. Callie and I have finished watching all 144 episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So next week on DW Lit Presents, we're going to talk about it. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. This podcast executive producer is David Barsky and is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode is written and edited by me. Our logo is designed by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guest, Jason Davis. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point.
A Doctor Who podcast network.